I'd like to welcome each of you here today to State Line Seventh-day Adventist Church. I'd like to extend a special welcome to our visitors. We're glad you're here, glad you come to worship with us. And I'd also like to welcome the folks that are watching by different media things. Maybe you're on live stream, YouTube, or DVD. However you're joining us, we just ask that you're blessed by our worship service today. Our message today is going to be brought to us by Elder Jim Brackett, and his title is "The Eyes Have It." I'm looking forward to hearing this.
Happy Sabbath. Happy Sabbath. How are you all today? Good. Okay. This is one of my favorite songs, and I'm a little nervous. It's been a little while since I've been up here. I hope you enjoy.
This is probably the first time in your life, and maybe the last time, you'll ever hear a Seventh-day Adventist sermon that begins with a quotation from Charles Darwin. His book has a much longer title. Most of us know it by The Origin of the Species. This is what he says. To suppose that the eye, with all its inimitable contrivances, those are words you and I don't use very much, aren't they? I can hardly pronounce it. Inimitable means unusual, remarkable, astonishing, interesting, strange. And a contrivance is a device of some kind that does something. These contrivances that adjust the focus in our eyes to different distances, or others that emit different amounts of light. You all know about this. You hold something up in front of you, and maybe the Blue Mountains are in the background, and you can focus on this or that with hardly a thought, and your eyes make the focus. Everybody understands you go from a light room into a dark room or vice versa, and your eyes make adjustments. He's talking, of course, about that. But now it gets more complicated. These contrivances that correct spherical and chromatic aberration. Now, spherical, that refers to a ball, a sphere. Chromatic refers to color. And aberration means something isn't right. So let me explain a little to you about what he's referring to. He goes on to say, the fact that these could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, to be absurd in the highest degree. And by the way, I'm looking today at some scientific things about the eye to try to inspire you to think even more than the eye in terms of what God has given us. The text said, I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Now, most of you in this room, except maybe the little children, are aware these days of what we call our DNA, which I think you know is like a long, long ladder. And it's like you twisted the bottom and the top in different directions. Y'all with me on that? And that ladder actually has over 3 billion rungs in it. In every cell of our bodies, there's a copy of that, except red blood cells, always an exception. And the idea is, when he says that these contrivances came to be through natural selection, what he means is, by accident, and this happens frequently in all of us, in all our cells, something happens and one of those rungs is the wrong one. It becomes the wrong one. There's 4 kinds of rungs. A lot of you know about that. Every once in a while, one of those rungs gets switched to a different one than it was, and that can change something drastically about you, make you very sick or various kinds of things. In fact, there was a book written recently by a Nobel laureate. He refers to this situation, and many of you probably don't know that God designed our bodies to make scores and scores of specialized proteins that travel along the ladder in every cell and fix the mistakes. We've only known this for a few years. It's just astonishing. Our bodies make those unbelievably complex proteins. They don't have a mind, they're not a person or brain, but they are able to travel along our ladder, our DNA, and fix the mistakes. If it wasn't for that repairing process, the whole human race would vanish within several years. So Darwin is saying that by accident with these rungs, from time to time, and that happens all the time. You all know about viruses that mutate, don't you? They don't mutate because they have a brain and they say to themselves, I'm going to fix something. They mutate because by accident, and I'd like to get into more of that, but I just can't, the rungs in the DNA get changed all the time. And so that makes a different virus, and maybe we will get sicker or not so sick. But Darwin is using a term that every scientist understands, that if you made the right changes in the rungs, you could make something happen in that organism that didn't happen before. And he's claiming that these contrivances for light and focus and something more complicated all happened by one rung being changed at a time. Y'all with me on that? How many are sort of with me? Let me see your hands. How many are already lost? Can I see your hands? How many of you should have raised your hands and didn't? Try to stay with me. If you listen carefully and concentrate, I think I can help you to understand it. But let me just help you see something about what he meant when he said these problems. And by the way, notice that he himself is confessing that this thing is absurd that it could ever have happened by accident. That's pretty interesting for him to say that. So let's talk about the eye for a few minutes. The light comes in, the cornea does some bending, but we think of the lens, and then it focuses the light on the retina. This is an amazing structure. It's actually made, and some people think of the retina being at the back of the eye. It's actually almost the entire inside of the eye. And it's made up of 11, I'm going to take that little white, sort of a rectangle, which represent and amplify it till you can see the retina. It actually has 11 layers of cells. Let me make it full screen. And from here to here, there are 11 layers of cells, different kinds. And the whole thing is about the thickness of saran wrap. Any ophthalmologists in the crowd? Not a one? When I first put this together years ago, I was sharing it in a church, and I found out there were 7 ophthalmologists in the congregation. Actually, a couple of them are friends. So the light comes, and most of you in this room, and if you don't, you'll pick this up right away, there are these light receptors. They're actually nerve cells. We would call them neurons, but they're nerve cells. And you all know that they're called rods or cones, and the artist has tried to picture that. Most of you know that the cones, and if you can't remember cone, you can think of the C for color. The artist has pictured that some of the cones detect red light, some of the cones detect blue light, and some green. And then there are the rods, which look like a little rod. It's really, we say black and white. It's the intensity of the light that these things are able to tell. So all these layers in between are necessary. We'll look at that briefly. Here's the wires, if you will. All of these cells are nerve cells, so they kind of have what we might call wires, and they come together in a bundle and make the optic nerve. The idea that there is an optic nerve is incorrect. Each of the optic nerves is a bundle of 1 million nerves, not just a nerve. And that entire layer of cells, they all have to work for us to see anything. Now, in the big flat screen that some of you folks have in your homes, there are 4, if it was a 4K screen, I think most of you kind of know about that. There are 8 million little dots in that screen to make color so that you can see the picture. In the back of your eye, there are 150 million rods and cones so that you can see what your eye looks at. I say the back, the entire inside, I should say. 150 million wires, but when you get to the optic nerve, how many are there? Only a million. So among the many things that those different layers do, they take 150 million signals and reduce them to 1 million. Quite remarkable how that is accomplished. Only 1 million. All right. Now let me explain to you the problem that Darwin was talking about when he said these aberrations. I'm going to use a telescope mirror instead of a lens because it's a little more intuitive. So here's a telescope. The light comes in, strikes the mirror. The mirror is curved, so the light's reflected together, and someone can look and see the night sky. You all know about that. Let me show you something interesting. This mirror, if it's in the shape of a sphere or a ball, something interesting happens. Let me diagram it like this. So some light comes in at the edge of the mirror. If the mirror is in the shape of a ball, and it's focused here. But the light that comes from closer in from the edges focuses here, if the mirror is shaped like a ball or a sphere. So now that you have two places where the focusing is taking place, what do you suppose it would look like to you? It would be out of focus. It would be blurry. So when Darwin said the spherical aberration, this is what he's talking about, because the eye is a sphere, is it not? It's a ball. If it wasn't, you couldn't swing it left and right and up and down if it wasn't a ball. So that's the problem he's referring to. Now the lens would do something very similar. It's just a little easier to see how that happens with a mirror. Now this boy shoots a ball into the air, and the path that it follows once it leaves his hand is the path that anything follows when you let go of it in gravity. For him, he's using about this part of the path. This thing has a name, a mathematical name. If you drop your scissors on the floor in the kitchen, maybe you'd be following this part. Are y'all with me? No matter what you let go of in the gravitational field, it follows this interesting shape. If you toss it up, you see the picture on the screen. If you just drop it, it's just a kind of a portion of it. And I'm not going to give you the name of it. A lot of you in this room would be familiar with it. But here's what happens. If you take just the upper portion of it and make a mirror of that shape, here's what you have. No matter where the light strikes the mirror, it all focuses in one place. Got that? Isn't that remarkable? Aren't you glad you know that? The problem is you can't do that with the eye because it is that's right. So Darwin, it's amazing that as far back as he wrote this book, he was aware of these kinds of things. It's quite remarkable. Now, that's the spherical problem. And we say the eye is a ball, which is correct. Now, what about the color issue, or chromatic? Everybody remembers in grade school when your teacher showed you that white light actually is made up of the rainbow colors using a prism. And I think you would agree with me that the lens in a camera is kind of like that. Doesn't that look about the same shape? So when light passes through a lens, the colors get separated. Are y'all with me on that? Some of you are listening with your eyes closed. I do that all the time. In the middle of the night, when my wife and I wake up, sometimes she reads to me and I listen with my eyes closed. And I hear every word. When she's done, I can't remember a word. So try, if you can, to keep your eyes open. And are y'all with me on that? The lens separates the colors. And that means that the image is fuzzy. And if you put let's say the retina there, you could see blue light, but the other colors would be out of focus. That's the idea. So, and of course Darwin realized that the eye was correcting for this, and he realized that to claim you could make that happen by changing one rung at a time. What did he say it was? Absurd. Underline that word. Absurd. The whole scientific community, I shouldn't say that. Do you know that an increasing number of scientists today are becoming believers? It's remarkable because of the advances in understanding the complexity of so many things. This isn't in the notes, but if you're taking notes either here or here, write down the name James tour, like a tour bus. And get on YouTube and listen to him. He's probably the most famous organic chemist in the world. All of the scientists recognize that he's going to get the Nobel Prize for what he has done. And he interviews scientists, famous scientists, who have become believers. And these people are Nobel laureates and other very well-respected scientists that are saying there has to be a designer. Very, very interesting. And the first question he asks them is, you're an educated person. How can you believe that the resurrection of Jesus Christ actually occurred? Now, Jim believes that. You understand that. And it's fascinating to hear these scientists answer that question as to how they have come to believe that. Very, very interesting. Now, in your iPhone or in a camera, scientists have figured out a way using a different kind of glass that's shaped differently to make the color come back together. But that's not the way God designed the eye, interestingly enough. Now, enter Richard Dawkins and his book, the first one, The Blind Watchmaker. Then he's written a book, The God Delusion, tragic thing. But a very esteemed scientist has written a book called let's see, now I suddenly can't say the name of the book. It's an answer to Dawkins' book. But anyway, Dawkins is kind of known as the bulldog, that he's very articulate, very capable, and just is certain that there could never have been a creator or a designer. But nevertheless, this is what he said. Notice this very interesting comment. Any engineer would naturally assume that the photocells, that's the rods and the cones, would point towards the light, with their wires leading backwards towards the brain. He would laugh at a suggestion that the photocells might point away from the light, with the wires on the side or going toward where the light is coming from. And yet this is exactly what happens. Let me help you understand what's going on here. Dawkins is using the design of the human eye to say that a wise God would not have done it like that. So let me help you see that. He's arguing that evolution didn't get it quite right. Because you may not know this, but all the rods and the cones in your retina are pointing away from the light. Y'all with me? Some are not nodding. I'm an old teacher, folks. Some of you know this. Without even thinking about it, I know what everybody in the room is doing. So please let your face inform me that you understand, all right? So his argument is, if it had been designed by an intelligent God, he obviously would have had the rods and the cones point toward the light. And because they point away, the evolution made it work, but didn't get it quite right. Do you understand his argument? All right. Very, very interesting. So here's another diagram. The light's coming from the left, and you can see the rods and the cones on the right. Here comes the light, and there they are. And here are the wires. That bundle of wires vertically there is the optic nerve. Are y'all still with me? And how many neurons are in that bundle? 1 million. And his point is that that's all that's in the way of the light. All those wires are going to mess the light coming in. Are y'all with me on that idea? So the wires departing near the light, his argument is, shows that it wasn't a good design, even though evolution somehow made it work. Now, let me help you understand what God actually did. And I'm going to use something most of you are very familiar with, fiber optics. The idea is that in those cables you see them putting underground out there, about that big around, there's several hundred very tiny plastic strings, and you can you can actually see the light sort of kind of coming out of the end of some of them. This is just a quick idea of how this works. You can make a light start in that little piece of plastic, and it'll travel for miles and come out the other end. And the beautiful thing about it is, if the light comes in at an angle, it doesn't matter. There's a fancy term for what I'm picturing there, but the light still comes out the other end, miles down the road. Even if the wire if the little plastic thing is bent, it still comes through out the other end. Now, here's a little scientific fact that I realize most of you haven't thought about this. Are you all aware that you can put millions of times as much data in that little plastic thing in comparison to a wire? Are you aware of that? If you didn't know it, you know it now, correct? That's why light is preferable to sending information than using electricity in a wire. So it sounds like somebody knew that before, right? And the light comes here trying to get through the wires that I've mentioned already so that the rods and the cones can see them. I'm going to back up for just a second and tell you something interesting. On the right-hand side of the picture, do you see this row? I'm going to try to draw it for you. This row of almost little squares with a little gray circle in it. Do you see that? That's the bottom layer of your retina. And the reason that God has the rods and the cones pointing and actually touching that layer is full of blood vessels. And I'll show you in a minute, when you actually see something with your rods and cones, it's a chemical reaction that's taking place and it makes heat. And if it wasn't for that layer, which for you looks like this, filled with blood vessels, the eye would burn up. So the blood is flowing through that layer to help dissipate the heat so the temperature of that retina doesn't destroy itself. Got that? Is that amazing or not? Someday I should get a hold of Richard Dawkins and straighten him out. What do you think? So it's a perfect design, but the problem is, how do you get the light to get to those rods and the cones at the other end? That's the problem. We only have known this for a few years. A scientist by the name of Mueller discovered what really is a fiber optic. On your screen, you can see the little cup on the end of the yellow, and that yellow, it's actually a nerve, it's a neuron, travels clear down to the back of the retina. And what happens is the light travels through all those layers of cells so the light can get to the rods and the cones. Did you get that? For those of you that are watching online, if you want to see the rest of this, you can get on YouTube later today, and they tell me it's going to be there. So these Mueller cells are able to carry the light clear down to where the rods and the cones are. And in fact, look at this. Because the red and the green and the blue are separated a little bit, you remember why? Because the lens bends them some. The cup on the end of the Mueller cell is just big enough to catch all three of them and pull them together so that it's in focus at the retina. Isn't that remarkable? Isn't that and the scientific community has only known this for a very short period of time. Quite amazing what we learn about God's handiwork. So here are the rods and the cones. This is an actual photograph magnified about 10 million times. You can see the rod there, if you will, and you can kind of see the cone shape there and so forth. And there's a picture on the bottom of essentially the same thing, but the two on the top are drawings. Can you see at the top of the rod, there's a little pancake there. Can you all see that? Can you see that in the back? Would you raise your hands, please? In the very back row. Very good. That little pancake, now that's not what scientists call it, but that little pancake has some chemicals in it that are sensitive to light. And when the light strikes them, they make a chemical signal, which, and by the way, this is a nerve. This is a neuron. All of those rods and cones are neurons, and what that means is they're able to send an electrical signal, just like the neurons in your brain. Y'all with me on that? So when the light strikes the pancake, there's a chemical reaction, and it causes this electricity, actually, to travel. The problem is that chemical reaction makes so much heat that it burns up the pancake. No problem. What's right below it? Another pancake. Can you see the same thing at the tip of the cone? Are y'all with me? And all of you know about this. Some of you have experienced it. If you're out in the snow, where it's really bright, maybe for several hours or all day, when you get home that night, you might have what we call snow blindness, because all the pancakes got burned up. Not to worry. This is astonishing, folks. The nerve cell keeps making pancakes, so that when you wake up in the morning, guess what? You can see just fine. Is this amazing or not? God's handiwork. I never fail to be just amazed. I'm a scientist, some of you know, and I just wonder. Now, the part of your brain that takes these two bundles of 1,000,000 signals, you could put your hand just above the base there, and it takes a whole lot of brain to process these things and make you and me see. We hardly give it a thought. We get up and we see. In fact, here's an interesting diagram that we could spend weeks on. There's the optic nerve, and the artist has made it part white and part black, only to show that half of the optic nerve stays on the same side of the brain, the black part, and half of it, the white part, goes to the other side of the brain. You follow that? And what's more remarkable even is that there are 2 synaptic branches. I think most of you are aware of the fact that a synapse is a place between 2 nerves where they do not touch. Our brain is nothing but synapses between nerve cells. But in this case, twice these signals have to be transmitted with physical chemical moving from one place to another to get the signal to the next place. Just astonishing. There's the other synaptic branch to make what you and I hardly ever think of. We just open our eyes and there it is. Now, here's a story. A little old now, but very, very interesting. This is Irwin Moon, who dreamed up the idea that he would like to make some videos. In those days, they were movies of things that were scientific that made people understand a little better their marvelous Creator. And he did this with the Moody Bible Institute. He called this series Sermon from Science. And he did some interesting things that made kids in classrooms excited. He's standing on a Van de Graaff generator, and they turn it on, and the sparks are flying, and so forth. And he created actually 18 of these movies. I used to show them in the classes. I taught at Upper Columbia Academy for 10 years and some other places as well. I love to show these to the students. Good science, but inspiring, always with a spiritual connotation. The one I think I liked the most was called Windows of the Soul. What Dr. Moon did, he had the craftsman in his lab build sort of a little bit like binoculars, and with a device that would hold those on his eyes. You can see that kind of strap there on his head. And what this device did was it turned what he saw upside down and left for right. Got it? I don't think you'd want to buy one of these, but and he put this on, and for 6 weeks he never opened his eyes unless he was looking through that. And this little video illustrates how difficult it was to do the simplest thing, to just grab a ball. He couldn't do it, that somebody rolled slowly across the table. Now, whenever he was going to go to sleep or whatever, he would close his eyes, take this off, and put a mask on, so that for 6 weeks he never looked at anything without looking through these inverters. And there he is. This is what he sees as he's walking down the street. And people are, of course, looking at him. And who is this strange creature? But after about 6 weeks, it became possible for him to negotiate life. And he tells about this in the movie. The movie's half an hour long that describes this whole thing. And finally, he's able to drive a motorbike. Let me see if I can make it play. I got to back up again now. There we go. And I think this will play now. He drives the motorbike, and then he flies an airplane, and with these things on, and he does all the regular maneuvers you're supposed to do to get your pilot's license. Upside down and left for right. So, I don't know, many of you may remember that there he is standing talking to the press. In 1974 in Spokane, Washington, there was a World's Fair. How many remember it? Let me see your hands. How come this side has so many more hands than this side? Do you not remember? How many ever went to the World's Fair? Oh, 25 of you, 30 of you. The North American Division, and if you're visiting here, that's an organization in the Seventh-day Adventist Church that sort of looks over the churches in all of the United States and Canada. They spent a fair amount of money and put in that building there at the World's Fair a display on better living. Does anybody remember ever going to that? Can I see your hands? 1, 2, I'm 3. It was a lot of electronics. You could watch a TV screen and various things on smoking and other items of health. And I suppose because I was the electronics teacher at UCA, I had no idea how that happened, but I was asked to take care of that thing for the 6 months the fair was open. So every day, just about every day, they give me a pass. Once I was out of school or during the summer, I was more free. I'd go in there, check everything, and if something was not working, I would fix it and so forth. And it happened that just outside the door from where that was, can you read it from where you're sitting? Sermons from Science. And if I had a little extra time, I would slip over there and sit down. The Moody Bible people, it was a room about half this size with pews, not chairs, pews in those days. And there was a Moody Bible person at the end of every pew, and people would sit and listen to one of Dr. Moon's programs. And at the end, the person at the end would try to have a spiritual conversation with the person that was sitting near them. It was a really nice thing. So I was over there one day, had a little extra time, even though I'd seen those and shown them to my students. Do you ever like to watch the same thing over again? We all do that. So there was this older man walking around with a camera. Older because he had white hair. That's why. And he was taking pictures here and there. And all of a sudden, I mean, it must have been 5 minutes of that at least, it dawned on me, that is Irwin Moon. 20 years after he did all these movies. and older, so I didn't recognize him right away. I jumped out of my seat and ran up to him and said, Dr. Moon, I'm a physics teacher in a local high school. I use your films. Could we talk? He said, sure. We went outside, went over by the river and sat down. And I wanted to know more about this thing that he had done. Are you all with me on that? At first, he thought I was going to do this to all my physics students. And he was quite exercised about that because as we were talking, this is what he told me. After the 6 weeks plus, they felt like the experiment was finished. And let me tell this first. And so now they're going to take the thing off, and he's going to open his eyes and see what happens. These are his exact words. I'll never forget them, I think. He said to me, in 30 seconds, I was a blithering idiot. So what was going on, and there was a sense that there might be a problem. There was a couple of physicians that grabbed him and took him into a dark room and laid him down. But what was going on was this. I'm sure you'll understand when I suggest that what he had was tunnel vision. Y'all with me? And in our conversation, I said to him, so what happened? Did the world kind of become right side up again? And he said, well, it's strange. He said, if I'd have walked into a room where there were two identical pictures and one was upside down and one was right side up, maybe I couldn't tell which was up. But it became completely normal for him so that, it was normal. The problem is, and by the way, don't most of you know that the image that's on our retina is upside down? You're aware of that. So in a way, the brain turns it right side up. But what was happening for him was that the part that he could see for 6 weeks became normal, and the other part was the same as before. And when he saw them both, it actually made him, to use his words, a blithering idiot. Seeing those things. Well, we talked for quite some time, and finally we thanked each other, and he went on his way. Let me finish with an interesting story. Somebody gave me a book a while back called Crashing Through. It's about a young man named Mike May who became blinded within several weeks of his birth. So he essentially grew up a blind person. He became very adept. He became famous. He became an engineer. He was an inventor. He actually, if you can imagine this, became a blind skier. He's the world's fastest blind skier. 60 miles an hour. I love to ski. 30 is quite enough for me. His ophthalmologist contacted him one day and said, there's a possibility that a new stem cell treatment could give you some vision back in one of your eyes. Would you like to do that? Now you might say in just a moment, oh, that's easy, yes. But on reflection, it wasn't that easy a decision. He and his wife talked it over for some time and finally decided that they should try it. And in fact, his vision in that eye was restored to a degree. But the scientists couldn't understand that he couldn't understand what he was seeing. It's a fascinating read. The technicians that worked with him, as well as the ophthalmologists, learned something that we had no clue about before. And that is this, to make the story kind of more compressed. When a baby is born, it has to learn to see in a similar way that it has to learn to talk. You mothers, well, fathers too, but you mothers know. You have this little brand new thing in your arms, and its eyes are just kind of wandering around. It takes several weeks before the baby learns how to make eye contact. Y'all with me on that? And finally, it has enough eye contact that what's happening is the first time the baby smiles at you. That's a wonderful event, isn't it? So here's what's happening. The optic nerve, actually, when the baby's born, there are still neurons that are growing toward the brain at the time of birth. But more than that, there is something like 1 trillion connections that exist in the brain that have to be cut, if you will, and another 1 trillion connections, different ones, that have to be established while the baby is learning to see. Got it? An amazing story. The remarkable thing that comes from this for me is John chapter 9. Jesus comes... Let me back up. There was a thought that I was struggling to get. During Mike May's recovery, he had to learn to see. How many of you old folks, I don't know if I should ask this question, would find it difficult to learn a brand new language? Let me see your hands, please. Some of you aren't telling the truth. But you understand, I couldn't learn a new language. I'm on my way to the garage to get something, and sometimes when I get there, I can't remember what I was after. Do you guys know about that? All you old folks? So it's almost impossible, folks. But you all know this. A child, a baby child, can learn effortlessly multiple languages if people are just speaking it around them. You all know about those studies. It's amazing because at that time of life, this plastic brain is a word we like to use, has been designed for that. So here's the story in John chapter 9. Jesus and the disciples see this blind man. I'm not going to take time for the whole story. I just want you to get a point here. Jesus apparently doesn't say a word to the man. He just makes some clay, some spit and dirt, and it'd be interesting to find out if he said, "Excuse me, sir." The Bible doesn't say a word. It just says he pasted it on his eyes and told him to wash. And the man comes back, and there are 3 words in the King James Version that are just astonishing beyond belief. It's okay, Mommy. We all have had it happen. Don't worry. These are the 3 words. He came seeing. Mike May, even today after 15 years, cannot recognize a face. He never learned to see. Y'all with me? And he's too old to learn to see. Y'all with me on that? When he sees something moving, it makes more sense to him. But just because the retina is working doesn't mean he can really see. Very interesting. So when it says that Jesus told him to wash, and I love this, folks, this is so powerful, he came seeing. Jesus didn't just fix the lens or something like that, folks. Jesus reprogrammed a couple of trillion connections. Let's pray. Father, we thank you this morning for your mighty hand. And your mighty hand in our physical bodies is remarkable. But it's a parallel, Lord, to your mighty hand for our spiritual connection with you. I pray that you'd bless us, Lord, that we can grasp more and more deeply what you can do and long to do in us that we might come seeing. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.